You thought you could run from the alien warrior bride? She's stowed away on your ship now. Kalen Voss was no stranger to escaping tight spots. He'd outrun bounty hunters, smugglers, and even entire planetary defense forces. But there was one thing he never expected to escape: the fierce grip of a warrior bride bound to him by a ritual he never agreed to. Now, as he cruises through deep space, all he wants is solitude. But when a fierce, amber-eyed alien warrior named Zara silently appears in his cargo hold, the world he fought so hard to keep at arm's length suddenly comes crashing into his ship and into his life. Want to see what happens next? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single moment of this epic space adventure. Kalen Voss leaned back in the pilot's seat of his newly stolen spacecraft, the hum of its engines vibrating through his bones. His calloused hands gripped the controls, guiding the sleek vessel away from the dusty red surface of Talrith. The planet shrank in the rear-view screen, its jagged cliffs and swirling storms fading into a crimson smear against the black void of space. At 32, Kalen had the look of a man forged by hard years: broad shoulders, a lean frame scarred from countless fights, and sharp gray eyes that rarely softened. His dark hair was cropped short, streaked with premature silver, a testament to a life spent dodging bullets and betrayal. He was a bounty hunter by trade, a loner by choice, and he liked it that way. Relationships, responsibilities, those were chains he'd never let bind him. The ship, a compact Predator-class runner he'd swiped from a careless smuggler, smelled of metal and stale fuel. It wasn't much, but it was his ticket out. Talrith loomed behind him, a world of ancient rituals and tribal politics he'd stumbled into by mistake. He'd been chasing a target, a slaver with a hefty price on his head, when the locals caught him. The Valtra, a fierce warrior tribe, didn't take kindly to outsiders poking around their territory. Instead of a quick payout, Kalen found himself dragged into a dimly lit chamber, surrounded by chanting elders and the heavy scent of incense. They'd forced him into a ceremony, one meant to tie him to a woman he'd never met, a Valtra warrior named Zara. Kalen's jaw tightened as he adjusted the ship's trajectory, punching in coordinates for a distant asteroid belt where he could lie low. The memory of the ritual gnawed at him. He'd stood there, shirtless under flickering torchlight, his wrists bound with coarse rope as the elders droned on in a language he didn't understand. Then she'd stepped forward, Zara, tall and commanding. Her presence hit him like a shockwave. Her body was a blend of strength and grace, covered in a fine layer of shimmering fur that hugged every curve. Her claws glinted in the firelight, and her eyes, a piercing amber, locked onto his with an intensity that made his pulse jump. The elders had called it a bonding rite, a sacred union to seal some alliance he didn't care about. It wasn't just words and chants, though. They'd expected something more, something physical, a touch, a connection, a merging he couldn't stomach. He'd bolted before it could happen. The moment they loosened the ropes, he'd shoved past the guards, snatched a blade from one of them, and fought his way to the smuggler's dock. Now, with Talrith disappearing behind him, he exhaled slowly, letting the tension seep out of his shoulders. Freedom was what he wanted, freedom to hunt, to drift, to live without anyone tying him down. The stars stretched out ahead, cold and endless, and he told himself that was enough. But deep down, a flicker of unease stirred. He'd spent years running from anything that felt like a tether, yet the emptiness inside him grew heavier with every job, every escape. He shook his head, pushing the thought away, and reached for the control panel to check the ship's systems. The engines purred steadily as he guided the vessel deeper into the void, the silence of space wrapping around him like a familiar cloak. Kalen's fingers moved over the controls with practiced ease, but his mind kept drifting back to Talrith. The ceremony replayed in fragments. The low hum of voices, the weight of Yara's gaze, the heat of the chamber pressing against his skin. He'd stood there, bare-chested and defiant, as the elders circled him. They'd painted symbols on his arms with some bitter-smelling oil, their chants rising like a storm. Then Zara had approached, her steps silent but deliberate, her fur catching the light in a way that made her seem almost unreal. She hadn't spoken, but her presence spoke volumes. Wild, untamed, and far too close for comfort. He remembered the moment her hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch meant to begin the rite's final stage. His skin had burned where her fingers grazed him, and his breath had caught, unbidden. That was when he'd snapped. He'd yanked free of the ropes, his heart pounding not just from the fight, but from something else, something he refused to name. The guards had lunged, but he was faster, stronger, driven by a need to get out before whatever they'd started could take hold. Now, alone in the cockpit, he rubbed his wrist where her touch had lingered, the sensation still prickling under his skin. Superstitious nonsense, he muttered, his voice rough in the quiet. The Valtrak could keep their rituals and their bonds. He didn't believe in fate, in cosmic ties, in anything that claimed to own him. He'd seen too much, planets torn apart by war, people selling their souls for credits, to put stock in ancient mumbo-jumbo. And yet, the memory of Yara's eyes wouldn't fade, sharp and unyielding, like they'd seen straight through his walls. The ship's console beeped, pulling him back to the present. He leaned forward, scanning the readouts. Fuel levels were good, navigation locked in. He'd be safe in the asteroid belt by morning if he kept this pace. Safe and alone. That was how he liked it, or so he told himself. The truth was harder to face. Kalen had spent his life running, not just from jobs gone bad or bounties turned sour, but from anything that threatened to anchor him. Friends, lovers, even family. He'd cut them all loose, one by one, until the only constant was the hum of a ship and the cold embrace of space. It was freedom, sure, but it came with a cost he rarely let himself feel. Tonight, though, that cost pressed against him, a dull ache he couldn't shake. He stood, stretching his arms overhead, his muscles flexing under his worn jacket. The cockpit felt too small, too still. He paced to the viewport, staring out at the scattering of stars. Yara's face flickered in his mind again. Those amber eyes, that quiet strength. He didn't know her, didn't want to know her, but something about her had rattled him. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with a strange mix of defiance and curiosity. Or maybe it was the rite itself, the way it had made him feel exposed, vulnerable, like she'd already claimed a piece of him he hadn't meant to give. He snorted, turning away from the viewport. Ridiculous, he said aloud, as if saying it would make it true. Kalen dropped back into the pilot's seat, running a hand through his hair. He needed to focus. The asteroid belt was still hours away, and he had to stay sharp. No point dwelling on what he'd left behind. It was done, over, gone. He reached for a ration pack stashed under the console, tearing it open with a flick of his knife. The dry, tasteless bar crumbled in his mouth as he chewed, his eyes drifting to the controls again. Everything was running smooth, too smooth, almost like the universe was mocking him with its calm. He swallowed, wiping his hands on his pants, and leaned back, letting his gaze wander over the cockpit's cramped interior. A faint noise caught his ear, a soft, metallic clink from somewhere deeper in the ship. He froze, his hand hovering over the knife, still resting on his thigh. The sound came again, sharper this time, echoing from the cargo hold. His pulse kicked up a notch, not from fear, but from instinct honed by years of survival. Ships didn't make noises like that on their own. He stood slowly, gripping the blade, and moved toward the narrow corridor leading aft. The lights flickered overhead as he stepped forward, his boots silent against the metal floor, his senses straining for any hint of what, or who, might be waiting. Kalen's grip tightened on the knife as he edged toward the cargo hold, the faint metallic clink still echoing in his ears. The corridor was narrow, its walls dented and streaked with rust, the dim overhead lights casting long shadows that danced with each step. His boots pressed silently against the cold floor, every muscle in his body coiled, ready to strike. He'd survived too many ambushes to let his guard down now. Pirates, rival hunters, even rogue droids could have stowed away on a ship like this. The stolen vessel was fast, but it wasn't secure, and he cursed himself for not sweeping it thoroughly before takeoff. His breath steadied as he reached the hatch, a heavy slab of steel that groaned softly when he pressed the release. The door slid open with a hiss, and a wash of cool air spilled out, tinged with the sharp scent of engine grease. Kalen stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the murky glow of a single flickering bulb overhead. Crates lined the walls, their edges chipped and battered, but it was the figure in the center that stopped him cold. Zara stood there, bathed in the faint light, her presence filling the cramped space like a storm about to break. She was a Valtral warrior through and through, tall and powerfully built, her body a tapestry of lean muscle wrapped in a fine layer of shimmering fur. It clung to her curves, accentuating every line from her broad shoulders to the dip of her waist, glinting softly as she shifted. Her claws, long and razor-sharp, caught the light, and her amber eyes burned like twin flames, locking onto him with a force that made his chest tighten. Her silver hair spilled over her shoulders, wild and untamed, and her breath puffed out in small, hot clouds, warming the chilly air between them. For a moment, Kalen couldn't move. He took an instinctive step back, his heel hitting the threshold, his heart slamming against his ribs. She was real, too real, and more striking than he remembered from the ritual chamber. Back on Talrith, she'd been a figure in the chaos, a silhouette against the firelight. Here, in the stark intimacy of his ship, she was undeniable. Heat radiated from her, a primal energy he could feel even from a few paces away, stirring something deep in his gut. His throat went dry, and when he finally found his voice, it came out rougher than he intended. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, the words scraping past his lips. Zara didn't flinch. She straightened, her posture unyielding, and took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Her voice rolled out, low and resonant, carrying a warmth that seemed to seep into his bones. "We didn't finish the ritual," she said, her tone steady but edged with something sharp. "Anger, maybe your resolve. I'm not letting you run from it that easily." Her eyes never left his, pinning him in place, and the weight of her words hit him like a punch. She wasn't just here by chance. She tracked him, slipped aboard, using some kind of Valtra tech he hadn't even noticed. He caught a glimpse of a small device clipped to her belt, its surface shimmering faintly before fading into the shadows. Cloaking tech, no doubt. She'd been invisible until this moment, a ghost haunting his escape. Kalen's grip on the knife tightened, his knuckles whitening as he fought to steady himself. "Get off my ship," he growled, pointing the blade toward the hatch. His voice was firm, but inside, he was reeling, anger clashing with a flicker of something else, something he didn't want to name. She didn't belong here, in his space, in his life. He'd left Talrith to avoid this exact thing. The ritual, the suffocating idea of being bound to anyone. But Zara didn't budge. She stood her ground, her claws flexing slightly at her sides, her gaze cutting through him like she could see every crack in his armor. "You can't order me out," she said, her voice dropping lower, almost a challenge. "The bond's already started. You feel it, don't you?" Her words sent a jolt through him, and he hated how they rang true. There was something, a pull, a thread tugging at him ever since he'd fled the planet. He'd chalked it up to adrenaline, to the chaos of the escape, but now, standing here with her, he couldn't deny it. His skin prickled where she'd touched him during the rite, a faint echo of heat that hadn't faded. He shook his head, shoving the thought down. "That's nonsense," he snapped, taking a step toward her, the knife still raised. "I don't believe in your tribal garbage. Get out, or I'll make you." Yara's lips twitched, a hint of a smirk curling at the edges, but her eyes stayed hard. She moved closer, her fur brushing the air just inches from him, and the warmth of her body washed over him like a tide. "You can't make me," she said softly, her breath grazing his cheek. "The connection's in you now, Kalen Voss. It's biological, our pulses, our instincts. I can't leave you any more than you can shake me off." Her voice was calm, but there was a fire beneath it, a strength that made his stomach twist. She wasn't pleading or begging. She was stating a fact, and it infuriated him. He lunged forward, intending to grab her arm and drag her to the airlock, but she sidestepped with a fluid grace that left him grasping at empty air. Her claws clicked against the floor as she circled him, her movements deliberate, almost predatory. "You're angry," she said, her tone maddeningly even. "Good. Feel it. It means you're alive. It means you're tied to me, whether you like it or not." Kalen spun to face her, his chest heaving, torn between the urge to throw her out and the strange, magnetic pull that kept his feet rooted. She was right. He was angry, furious even, but beneath that simmered something raw, something that flared every time her eyes met his. He lowered the knife slightly, his breath ragged, tried to regain control. She was too close now, her scent, a mix of spice and wild earth, flooding his senses, making it hard to think. "I don't want this," he said, his voice quieter but no less firm. "I don't want you." Yara tilted her head, studying him, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of something softer in her gaze. Uncertainty, maybe, or defiance. "That's not your choice anymore," she replied, her words hanging heavy in the air. She stepped back, giving him space, but her presence lingered, inescapable. Kalen glared at her, his mind racing for a way out, a plan, anything to reclaim the freedom he'd fought so hard for. He turned toward the crates, pretending to check them, needing a moment to steady his pounding heart. His fingers brushed the rough edges of the metal, grounding him, but he could still feel her watching, her eyes boring into his back. The cargo hold was silent except for the faint hum of the ship, and he moved to inspect a loose panel near the wall, his hands working automatically as he tried to focus on something. Anything, other than the woman standing behind him. Kalen stormed out of the cargo hold, his boots thudding against the metal floor as he headed for the cockpit. Yara followed, her steps lighter but no less determined, her claws clicking faintly behind him. The narrow corridor seemed to shrink with every breath, the air thick with the unspoken weight of her presence. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Her words still burned in his ears, that talk of bonds and biology, and he needed space to think, to breathe, to shove her out of his head. The cockpit door slid open, and he stepped inside, the familiar hum of the controls a small comfort against the chaos she'd brought with her. He dropped into the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the armrests, but the peace didn't last. Yara entered moments later, her tall frame filling the doorway, her amber eyes fixed on him with that same unrelenting intensity. He spun the chair to face her, his jaw tight. "What now?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the cramped space. The cockpit was small, barely enough room for the console, the seat, and a sliver of standing space. And with Yara here, it felt suffocating. She stood just a few feet away, her fur shimmering faintly under the blue glow of the screens, her chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. She crossed her arms, claws resting against her biceps, and met his glare head-on. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying a warmth that clashed with the cold steel around them. "You can't keep pretending I'm not here." Kalen's fists clenched. "I don't belong to anyone," he growled, leaning forward, his gray eyes narrowing. "Not you, not your tribe, not some damn ritual." His words were sharp, meant to push her away, but as they spilled out, his gaze betrayed him. It slipped just for a second, tracing the curve of her shoulder, the way her fur hugged the lines of her body, dipping down to her waist. She was a warrior, yes, but there was something else, something raw and magnetic that made his throat tighten. He swallowed hard, forcing his eyes back to hers, but the damage was done. She'd seen it, and a flicker of something, amusement, maybe, crossed her face. Yara stepped closer, her boots scuffing the floor, her voice softening but no less firm. "You think I chose this?" she said, her tone laced with frustration. "The Valtra forced me into that right. It was their way of binding me, of controlling me. I didn't want you either, Kalen Voss, but here we are." She stopped just short of him, her heat brushing against him like a wave, and he could feel it, the pull she'd talked about, a thread tugging at his senses. "The bond isn't my doing," she added, her eyes searching his. but it's real, and it's not going away. He opened his mouth to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the ship chose that moment to lurch. A sharp jolt rocked the cockpit, the lights flickering as a warning beep shrilled from the console. Kalen cursed under his breath and spun back to the controls, his hands flying over the panel. "Hold on," he barked, scanning the readouts. A power surge. Something in the engine bay had overloaded. The ship steadied, but the alert kept flashing, insistent. "We've got a problem," he muttered, shoving out of the seat and heading for the maintenance hatch in the corner. Zara followed without a word, her presence a shadow at his back. The hatch was tiny, barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. Kalen crouched, prying it open with a grunt, and slid inside, his shoulders scraping the edges. The space was a tangle of wires and pipes, lit only by the faint glow of a backup panel. He reached for a sparking conduit, his fingers fumbling with a tool from his belt, when Zara squeezed in beside him. There was no room to maneuver. Her body pressed against his, her chest brushing his shoulder through the thin fabric of his shirt, her fur soft but warm against his skin. Her breath grazed his neck, hot and steady, and he froze, the tool slipping in his grip. "Move," he said, his voice tight, trying to shift away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls boxed them in, and her closeness was overwhelming. "I'm helping," she replied, her tone clipped as she reached past him, her arm brushing his chest. Her claws deftly adjusted a valve, stopping the sparking, but the movement only pressed her tighter against him. Kalen's hand shot out to steady himself, landing on her waist, and he felt it, the heat of her skin beneath the fur, the firm curve under his fingers. A jolt ran through him, sharp and electric, and his breath hitched. He yanked his hand back, his palm tingling, but the damage was done. The air between them thickened, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the ship. Her eyes flicked to his, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her irises, and for a moment, neither of them moved. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the hum of the engines. "I've got it," he said brusquely, shoving the tool back into the conduit, forcing his focus onto the repair. His hands trembled slightly, betraying him, and he clenched his jaw, willing them steady. Zara shifted, giving him a fraction more space, but her scent, wild and earthy, lingered, wrapping around him like a snare. He wanted to push her away, to reclaim the distance he'd always kept, but his body wouldn't listen. It remembered her touch from the ritual, the way it had burned, and now, pressed against her in this tiny space, that memory roared back to life. He hated it, hated how she unraveled him without even trying. She wasn't at ease either. He caught the way her breath faltered when his shoulder brushed hers again, the way her eyes flickered with confusion, maybe even discomfort. "You feel it too," she murmured, so quiet he almost missed it over the whine of the machinery. Her voice wasn't accusing, it was raw, unguarded, and it hit him harder than he expected. He didn't answer, couldn't, his throat too tight to form words. Instead, he twisted the last wire into place, the panel humming back to life, and pulled himself out of the hatch, needing air, needing space. Kalen stood, brushing the grime off his hands, his back to her, as she climbed out behind him. His shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat, and he could still feel the ghost of her body against his. Her warmth, her strength, the way she'd fit into that moment like she belonged there. He moved to the console, checking the readouts again, his fingers tapping restlessly against the screen. The ship was stable now, the alert silenced, but the quiet only amplified the sound of her breathing a few steps away. He kept his eyes on the controls, forcing his mind to the task, but her shadow stretched across the floor, a reminder he couldn't escape. The ship drifted silently through the void, its engines a low hum beneath the floor. Kalen sat in the cockpit, staring out the wide viewport at a scattering of stars, their cold light painting faint streaks across his face. He'd been avoiding Zara since the repair in the hatch, keeping to himself, burying his thoughts in navigation charts and system checks. But tonight, the quiet felt heavier, pressing against him until he couldn't ignore it. He heard her before he saw her, soft footsteps, the faint click of claws on metal. And then she was there, stepping into the cockpit. She didn't say anything at first, just settled onto the narrow bench across from him, her tall frame folding gracefully into the space. The starlight caught her fur, making it shimmer like liquid silver, tracing the contours of her shoulders and arms in a way that drew his eye despite himself. Yara sat still, her amber gaze fixed on the viewport, her silver hair spilling over one shoulder. The silence stretched, thick but not uncomfortable, until she finally spoke. "You don't know me," she said, her voice low and resonant, cutting through the hum of the ship. "Not really." Kalen shifted in his seat, his hands resting on his knees, but he didn't interrupt. She took a slow breath, her chest rising under the tight fabric of her tunic, and continued. "The Valtra, my people, they're warriors. Proud, strong. I was one of their best, trained to fight, to lead. But that didn't matter to the elders. To them, I was a tool, a piece in their games." Her claws flexed slightly, glinting in the dim light, and her tone hardened. "The ritual wasn't my choice. They forced it on me, said it would bind our tribe to an outsider, strengthen our alliances. I had no say." Kalen watched her, his gray eyes narrowing slightly. He'd assumed she'd wanted the bond as much as the Valtros seemed to, but the bitterness in her voice told a different story. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her thighs, and the movement made her fur catch the light again, highlighting the strength in her frame. "I fought them," she said, quieter now. "Tried to refuse. But they don't care about what I want. They never have." She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor, and then she reached up, tugging at the collar of her tunic. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled it aside, revealing a jagged scar that ran across her shoulder, cutting through the soft fur. It was old, faded, but brutal, a mark etched deep into her flesh. He didn't mean to move, but his hand lifted before he could stop it, fingers brushing the edge of the scar. The fur there was thinner, softer, and warm under his touch, a stark contrast to the roughness of the healed wound. Yara tensed at first, her breath catching, but she didn't pull away. Up close, he could feel the heat radiating from her, the faint pulse beneath her fur, and the air between them grew heavy, charged with something unspoken. Her eyes flicked to his, wide and unguarded, and she whispered, "You're the only one who doesn't want to own me." Her voice was barely audible, raw with a vulnerability he hadn't expected, and it hit him like a quiet blow. Kalen's hand lingered for a moment longer, his fingertips tracing the line where fur met scar, before he pulled back, dropping his arm to his side. He didn't know what to say. Words weren't his strength, but her confession stirred something in him, a flicker of recognition. He'd spent his life running from control, from anything that tried to claim him, and here she was, a mirror to his own fight. "I don't own anyone," he said finally, his voice rough but steady, his gaze holding hers. "And I don't plan to start." Yara's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but her posture eased slightly, the tension in her shoulders softening. "Good," she murmured, leaning back against the bench, her fur brushing the wall behind her. "Because I'm not here to be kept." She looked out at the stars again, her profile sharp against the glow, and Kalen felt a shift, small, almost imperceptible, but real. She wasn't the enemy he'd made her out to be, not some enforcer of the Valtra's will. She was trapped, just like he'd been on Talrith, and that realization gnawed at him. The bond, whatever it was, wasn't just their burden. It was their bridge, a thread tying two people who'd never asked for it. He shifted in his seat, crossing his arms, trying to shake the weight of the moment. But it clung to him, her words echoing in his head, her warmth still lingering on his fingertips. He'd felt alone for so long, a solitary figure drifting through the galaxy. And yet here, with her, that solitude cracked. Not because of the ritual, not entirely, but because of her. The way she carried her strength, her scars, her defiance. It matched something in him, a quiet ache he'd buried under years of running. Yara adjusted her tunic, covering the scar again, her claws clicking softly as she smoothed the fabric. She didn't push him to say more, didn't demand anything, and he was grateful for that. The cockpit settled back into silence, the stars rolling past outside, endless and indifferent. Kalen leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely as he stared at the floor. The ship's hum filled the space between them, steady and familiar, and he let his mind drift, watching the faint reflection of her fur in the polished edge of the console. The peace didn't last long. Kalen was hunched over the cockpit console, recalibrating the ship's sensors, when a sharp ping cut through the silence. An incoming signal, too close for comfort. He straightened, his fingers hovering over the controls, and pulled up the scanner. 3 blips appeared, small but fast, closing in from the edge of the asteroid belt he'd been aiming for. Bounty hunters. His jaw tightened as he recognized the signatures. Cheap raider ships, the kind hired by scum who didn't care about finesse, only results. Someone must have tracked him from Talrith. Probably the smuggler he'd stolen the ship from, out for blood or credits. Trouble, he muttered, slamming a fist against the panel. Yara was at his side in an instant, her fur brushing his arm as she leaned over to peer at the screen. "How many?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. Her claws flexed, glinting in the dim light, and Kalen felt a flicker of relief. She wasn't running, wasn't hesitating. 3, he said, spinning the chair to face the weapons controls. "We can't outrun them in this junk heap. We'll have to fight." She nodded, her amber eyes narrowing, and moved to the co-pilot station without a word. The ship jolted as the first raider fired, a plasma bolt grazing the hull, and Kalen gritted his teeth. "Hold on." He banked hard, steering the ship into the asteroid field, weaving between jagged rocks that loomed like silent giants. The raiders followed, their shots lighting up the void, and Kalen returned fire, his fingers dancing over the triggers. A burst from the ship's cannons clipped one of the pursuers, sending it spinning into a boulder with a satisfying crunch. One down, he growled, but the other 2 were gaining, their engines roaring through the calm static. Yara sprang from her seat, her movements fluid, and headed for the cargo bay. "I'll handle the rear," she called over her shoulder, her silver hair trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Kalen didn't argue. He couldn't afford to. He kept the ship twisting through the field, dodging debris and enemy fire, while Yara's voice crackled through the internal comm. "They're boarding," she said, her tone sharp. He glanced at the scanner. Sure enough, one of the raiders had latched onto the hull, its grappling hooks biting deep. The ship shuddered as the intruders breached the cargo bay, and Kalen grabbed his pistol, bolting from the cockpit. He reached the hold just as the fight broke out, the air thick with the clang of metal and the snarl of combat. Yara was a whirlwind. Her claws slashed through the first hunter, tearing through his armor like paper, her fur bristling with every strike. Kalen raised his gun, dropping another with a clean shot to the chest, the muzzle flash lighting up the dim space. They moved together, instinctive and precise, his bullets covering her as she lunged at a third attacker. A stray shot whizzed past Kalen's head, and before he could react, Yara was there, shoving him aside. The bolt grazed her arm instead, scorching her fur, and she hissed but didn't falter, pinning the shooter to the floor with a claw to his throat. Kalen stumbled, catching his balance, and his hand shot out, grabbing her waist to steady himself. His fingers sank into the warmth of her fur, feeling the taut muscle beneath, and for a split second, he forgot the chaos. There was only her, strong and alive, under his touch. The last hunter fell, and the cargo bay went quiet, save for the hiss of a damaged pipe overhead. Kalen released her, his hand lingering a moment too long, and Yara stepped back, her chest heaving, a thin line of singed fur marking her arm. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough, his eyes flicking to the wound. She nodded, brushing it off, but her gaze held his, steady and fierce. "We're not done," she said, pointing to the scanner on the wall. The third raider was circling, waiting for its chance. Kalen cursed under his breath and gestured toward a maintenance nook near the bay door. "In there. We'll wait it out." The nook was barely a closet, a tight space packed with cables and spare parts. Kalen squeezed in first, pressing against the wall, and Yara followed, her body sliding against his as she wedged herself beside him. There was no room to breathe. Her fur brushed his chest, her hip pressed into his, and her breath, warm and quick, grazed his cheek. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and strong, syncing with his own in a rhythm he couldn't ignore. The Raider's engines rumbled outside, a low drone that vibrated through the hull, and they stayed still, listening, watching through a narrow slit in the door. Her shoulders shifted, rubbing against his, and he clenched his jaw, fighting the heat rising in his chest. Her scent, wild and earthy, filled the cramped space, and he had to force his hands to stay at his sides, resisting the urge to grip her again. Minutes passed, the Raider's shadow drifting past, and then it was gone, retreating into the asteroid field. Kalen exhaled, his breath mingling with hers, and realized his hand had settled on her lower back, resting there like it belonged. She didn't pull away, and when their eyes met, hers burned with something raw, desire, maybe, or defiance. Neither of them moved, the air between them thick with unspoken tension, but they didn't act on it. The moment hung there, fragile and electric, until Kalen shifted slightly, his fingers brushing her fur as he adjusted his stance. "They're gone," he muttered, his voice low, almost reluctant. Yara nodded, her gaze still locked on his, and slid out of the nook first, her body brushing his one last time as she stepped into the open. Kalen followed, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness and the feeling of her against him. The fight had changed something, though he wouldn't admit it aloud. Every clash, every move they'd made together, had built a trust he hadn't expected. He couldn't deny it anymore. He needed her, not just to survive this mess, but because she made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. Her presence was a spark, igniting parts of him he'd long kept buried, and it scared him as much as it drew him in. He moved to the scanner, checking the readings to confirm the Raider was truly gone, his fingers tapping the screen with a restless energy. Yara stood a few paces away, inspecting the singed patch on her arm, her claws tracing the edge of the burn. The cargo bay was a mess, scattered gear, scorch marks on the walls, but they'd made it through, together. Kalen glanced at her, catching the way her fur caught the light, and turned back to the scanner, focusing on the blinking dots fading into the distance. The cargo bay settled into an uneasy quiet after the fight, the hum of the ship's systems filling the space where chaos had reigned moments before. Kalen leaned against a crate, wiping sweat from his brow, his pistol still warm in his hand. Yara stood nearby, her fur slightly ruffled from the battle, her claws retracting as she shook out her singed arm. The air between them felt different now, thicker, charged with something neither of them could name. He caught himself watching her, the way her fur shimmered under the flickering lights, tracing the lines of her body with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. He looked away, focusing on holstering his gun, but the image lingered, stubborn and vivid. Yara moved to a workbench, her silver hair swaying as she bent to pick up a fallen tool. The motion stretched her tunic tight across her back, highlighting the strength in her frame, and Kalen's breath hitched. He clenched his fists, trying to bury the heat creeping up his neck, but it was no use. Her presence was everywhere, her scent, wild and spiced, drifting through the hold. Her voice, still echoing in his mind from the nook, soft and raw. He wanted to deny it, to keep the walls he'd built intact, but every glance, every brush of her fur against him, chipped away at his resolve. She straightened, turning slightly, and their eyes met, hers sharp and searching, cutting through the distance like a blade. "You're staring," she said, her tone light, but edged with a challenge, her lips twitching into a half-smile. Kalen's throat tightened, and he shrugged, forcing a casualness he didn't feel. "Just making sure you're not bleeding out," he replied, his voice gruffer than intended. She stepped closer, her claws clicking faintly on the floor, and the space between them shrank until he could feel the warmth radiating from her fur. "I'm fine," she murmured, her gaze holding his, and for a moment, he thought she might say more, something about the fight, about them. But she didn't. Instead, she reached past him to grab a rag from the crate, her arm brushing his chest, and his skin tingled where her fur grazed him. He didn't move, couldn't, his body rooted as the sensation sank in. The bond was growing, not just in the heat of battle, but in these quiet moments, where her nearness felt less like an intrusion and more like a necessity. She made him feel alive, sharp-edged and real, and he hated how much he craved it. Yara wiped her hands with the rag, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes flicking to his now and then. Kalen turned to the crate, pretending to organize the scattered gear, his fingers brushing over a dented panel as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. The ship hummed softly as it hovered near a refueling station, a ramshackle outpost orbiting a gas giant's outer rings. Kalen had powered down the engines, letting the automated pumps siphon energy from the station's grid. The cockpit was bathed in the faint orange glow of the planet below, its swirling clouds casting shifting patterns across the walls. He stood by the viewport, arms crossed, staring out at the endless expanse, trying to lose himself in the view. But his focus shattered when Yara stepped in, her presence pulling at him like gravity. She moved to the console, her fur catching the light as she bent to check the refueling progress, her silver hair spilling over one shoulder. She was close, too close, only a few inches away, and the air between them thickened with her warmth. Kalen's hands tightened against his biceps, his breath shallow as he felt the heat radiating from her. She was a warrior, fierce and unyielding, but up close, there was something softer in the way her fur framed her curves, the way it shimmered with every subtle shift. He tried to look away, to focus on the planet's rings, but then she leaned forward to adjust the dial, her tunic pulling tight across her back. His hand moved before he could stop it, brushing her hip as he reached for a non-existent tool on the console. The contact was brief, a graze of his fingers against her fur, but stopped them both cold. Yara froze, her claws hovering over the controls, and Kalen's breath caught, his pulse hammering in his ears. Neither moved, the moment stretching taut, their breathing sinking in the quiet. She straightened slowly, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze, her amber eyes sharp and searching. He pulled his hand back, flexing his fingers as if to shake off the heat of her, but it lingered, a stubborn ache under his skin. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice rough, barely audible over the hum of the ship. Yara didn't respond, just watched him, her fur bristling slightly as if she felt it too. The pull, the tension that had been building since the asteroid fight. They couldn't deny it anymore, not when every glance, every accidental touch, set his nerves alight. He stepped back, putting the console between them, but the distance didn't help. Her scent, wild and spiced, followed him, tugging at something deep in his chest. Inside, Kalen was a mess. He'd spent his life guarding his freedom, building walls to keep everyone out, and Yara was tearing them down without even trying. He was terrified of what it meant. If he let her in, let her get closer, he'd lose the only thing he'd ever truly owned, himself. But every time she was near, that fear warred with a hunger he couldn't bury. He wanted to touch her again, to run his hands through her silver hair, to feel the warmth of her fur against his palms, to taste the breath she exhaled so close to him now. It was maddening, this pull, and he hated how it stripped him bare, exposing a need he'd never wanted to feel. He clenched his jaw, staring at the console's blinking lights, willing his mind to stay sharp, to stay his. Yara wasn't immune either. He saw it in the way her claws twitched, the way her eyes flickered when their shoulders brushed during the refuel check. She didn't want to be bound. Not by the Valtra, not by him. But there was something in Kalen that drew her, a strength she respected, a gentleness he hid beneath his rough edges. She fought it, her posture stiffening as if to hold herself back, but the attraction was there, simmering beneath her defiance. They were two forces colliding, neither willing to yield, yet unable to pull apart. The cockpit felt smaller with every passing second, the the space shrinking until it was just them, locked in a silent battle of want and restraint. Hours later, a magnetic storm rolled in, a chaotic swirl of energy from the gas giant that scrambled the ship's sensors. Kalen wrestled with the controls, the cockpit shaking as static crackled through the comms. Yara moved to help, her claws tapping the panel beside him, but a sudden lurch threw her off balance. She stumbled, falling into him, her body crashing against his chest. His arm shot out, catching her, and she landed in his lap, her hands pressing against his shirt, claws grazing the fabric. The ship steadied, but they didn't. Her fur brushed his neck, her breath hot against his jaw, and he felt her heartbeat through her palms, fast, strong, mirroring his own. The storm raged outside, lights flickering, but inside, time slowed, the world narrowing to the press of her against him. They stayed like that, frozen, her weight warm and solid in his arms. Her fingers curled slightly, digging into his chest, and he could feel the heat of her through his shirt, a fire that spread under his skin. He wanted to hold her there, to pull her closer, but the fear surged again. Fear of losing himself, of crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Gently, he slid his hands to her shoulders, easing her back, his touch firm but reluctant. She shifted, standing slowly, her hands lingering on him a moment longer before dropping away. Their eyes locked, and it said everything his voice wouldn't. "I don't want you to go." Hers flickered with the same conflict, a storm of her own, but she stepped back, giving him space he didn't truly want. Kalen turned to the controls, his hands gripping the edges of the panel, his knuckles white as he forced his focus to the storm readings. The ship rocked again, a faint tremor from the magnetic waves, and he adjusted the stabilizers, his movements mechanical. Yara stood behind him, her fur rustling softly as she brushed a strand of hair from her face, her presence a quiet weight in the room. The storm static buzzed through the speakers, a low drone that matched the hum in his chest, and he kept his eyes on the screen, tracing the jagged lines of the energy spikes. The storm had passed, leaving the ship drifting in a quiet pocket of space, the gas giant's rings a faint shimmer in the distance. Kalen sat on a crate in the cargo bay, the dim overhead lights casting long shadows across the scattered gear. He'd been restless since the cockpit incident, his mind churning with thoughts he couldn't outrun. Yara emerged from the corridor, her fur glinting softly as she stepped into the hold, her silver hair loose and wild from the chaos of the day. She didn't hesitate this time, crossing the space to sit on a crate opposite him, her claws resting lightly on her knees. The air felt heavy, not with tension, but with something deeper, something they'd both been circling for too long. Kalen leaned forward, elbows on his thighs, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low and rough, cutting through the silence like a blade. He hadn't meant it to sound so blunt, but the question had been gnawing at him, demanding an answer. Yara didn't flinch. She tilted her head, her amber gaze steady, and took a slow breath before replying. "I don't want to be owned anymore," she said, her tone firm but threaded with a quiet ache. "Not by the Valtra, not by anyone. But I want you, Kalen, not because of the ritual, not because of some bond they forced on us. Because of you." Her words hung there, raw and unguarded, and they hit him harder than he'd expected, stirring a heat in his chest he couldn't ignore. He didn't respond right away, his hands clasping together as he stared at the floor. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the weight of her confession, of the truth he'd been dodging. He wanted her too, in a way that was his own, not dictated by some ancient rite. It wasn't just her strength or her fire, though those drew him in. It was the way she saw him, the way she matched his edges and softened them at the same time. He'd spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone, that feelings were chains to be avoided. But sitting here, with her eyes on him, he couldn't pretend anymore. She wasn't a shackle. She was something he'd been missing, a piece he hadn't known was gone until she filled it. Yara shifted, her fur rustling faintly, and leaned closer, her elbows resting on her knees to mirror him. I've never chosen anything for myself, she said, quieter now, her voice softening. The Valtra took that from me. My fight's my life, even this bond. But you're different. I choose you. There was a freedom in her words, a defiance that broke through the weight of her past, and it struck him deep. For her, this wasn't about being trapped. It was about breaking free, about claiming something on her terms. And for him, it was a revelation. He'd always seen attachment as a loss, a surrender of control, but with her, it felt like finding something, strength, not weakness. He lifted his head, meeting her gaze again, and saw the same struggle reflected in her eyes, a pull she couldn't deny, a need she didn't want to fight. They weren't just bound by biology or fate. They were bound by something real, something they'd built through every fight, every quiet moment. The realization settled over him, heavy but warm, and he felt his walls crack further, letting her in. She wasn't here to take from him. She was here to stand with him, and that shifted everything. He exhaled, a slow release of the tension he'd carried for so long, and the space between them seemed to shrink, the crates no longer a barrier but a bridge. Kalen moved then, his hand reaching out, slow and deliberate, until his fingers brushed her cheek. Her fur was soft under his touch, warm and alive, and he traced the line of her jaw with a gentleness he rarely showed. Yara's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, surprise flickering there, but then she leaned into it, her head tilting toward his hand. Her breath grazed his wrist, hot and steady, and their faces drew closer, inches turning to mere breaths. He could feel her warmth, smell the wild spice of her scent, and his pulse raced as their lips hovered, so near he could almost taste her. The world narrowed to this, the crate beneath him, the hum of the ship, the heat of her against his fingertips. They paused, caught in that fragile space, the desire between them as clear as the stars outside, but neither pushed further, not yet. Her hand lifted, resting lightly on his knee, her claws retracted, and the touch sent a shiver through him. They stayed like that, locked in the moment, the cargo bay fading into the background. Kalen's thumb brushed her fur once more, a slow sweep along her cheekbone, and she let out a soft breath, her eyes half closing. He pulled his hand back, resting on his thigh, but the connection lingered, a thread tying them tighter with every second. Yara shifted, straightening slightly, her hand sliding off his knee to rest on the crate beside her. She glanced toward the viewport, the starlight catching her profile, and Kalen followed her gaze, his fingers tapping idly against his leg as the quiet settled back in, laced with the echo of their closeness. The ship rocked as a barrage of plasma fire lit up the void, the last of a relentless band of mercenaries closing in. Kalen gripped the controls, his knuckles white, weaving through a debris field littered with the wreckage of their earlier foes. Yara stood at the weapons station, her claws tapping furiously as she fired back, her silver hair whipping with each jolt. They'd been ambushed near a trade lane. Someone had put a fresh bounty on Kalen's head, and these hunters were better equipped than the last. A bolt slammed into the hull, sparking alarms, and Kalen cursed, banking hard to avoid a spinning chunk of metal. "They're on our tail," he shouted, his voice tight over the chaos. Yara didn't hesitate. She abandoned the console, racing to the rear hatch as another blast shook the ship. "I'll take them out," she called, her tone fierce, and Kalen nodded, trusting her without a second thought. He heard the hiss of the airlock as she slipped into the fray, her figure a blur on the external feed. The scanner showed 2 enemy ships, one circling, one boarding, and he gritted his teeth, pushing the engines to their limit. Then the feed flickered. Yara was outside, clinging to the hull, her claws digging into the metal as she lunged at the boarding craft. A stray shot grazed her path, and Kalen's heart lurched. He yanked the ship into a spin, drawing the fire away. But it wasn't enough. She was too exposed. Without thinking, he bolted from the cockpit, grabbing a tether line and racing to the airlock. The hatch slid open, and there she was, pinned by a mercenary's rifle, her fur singed but her eyes blazing. Kalen threw himself forward, the tether snapping taut as he tackled the attacker off her. The mercenary fired wildly, the bolt searing past his shoulder, and Yara sprang up, her claws slashing through the man's suit. Kalen grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the hatch, his hand clamping tight around hers. The heat of her fur burned through his glove, a jolt of fire spreading up his arm, and their eyes met, wild, alive, connected. They stumbled inside as the enemy ship broke away, damaged but retreating. The airlock sealed, and they collapsed against the wall, chests heaving, the ship steadying around them. Kalen's hand still gripped hers, and he felt it, their pulses sinking, a rhythm that thrummed through his veins. Her breath mingled with his, hot and ragged, and he couldn't look away from her amber eyes, glowing in the dim light. The bond wasn't just a story anymore. It was real, physical, undeniable. In the quiet that followed, with the alarm silenced and the stars still outside, he moved closer, his free hand lifting to her face. His fingers brushed her fur, and then their lips met, soft at first, tentative, a question answered in the press of her against him. She responded, her hand sliding to his shoulder, claws digging in as the kiss deepened, hungry and raw. Her body pressed into his, warm and solid, and he pulled her tighter, lost in the taste of her, the feel of her fur against his skin. They broke apart, breathless, foreheads resting together. "I'm done running," he whispered, his voice rough but sure, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Yara's lips curved, a rare, genuine smile breaking through her guarded exterior. "Neither am I," she murmured, her hand tightening on his shoulder. It wasn't just desire driving them now. It was understanding, a clarity that had grown through every fight, every touch. They weren't surrendering to the bond. They were choosing it, claiming it as theirs. The ship hummed around them, a steady pulse matching their own, and Kalen felt a shift. Being with her wasn't losing freedom, it was finding it. She was a part of him he hadn't known he needed, a mirror to his own restless soul. Yara stepped back, her fur brushing his arm as she moved, and glanced at the scanner, checking for lingering threats. Kalen watched her, his hand flexing where it had held hers, the warmth still lingering. The cargo bay was a mess, scattered tools, a dented wall, but they were alive, together, and that was enough for now. He moved to a crate, picking up a fallen wrench, his mind still buzzing with the feel of her lips, the weight of their choice. Hours later, the ship sailed smoothly through the void, its hull patched and its course set for a distant nebula. Kalen sat in the pilot's chair, the cockpit bathed in the soft glow of starlight streaming through the viewport. Yara settled beside him, her fur glinting as she leaned back, one claw tapping idly on the armrest. The silence between them was comfortable, a quiet born of trust rather than avoidance. She shifted, her hand moving to rest on his chest, her fingers splaying over his shirt, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her touch. He glanced at her, a flicker of heat in his gray eyes, and slid his arm around her, pulling her closer until her shoulder pressed against his. Their faces hovered near, lips just inches apart, and they shared a small, knowing smile. No words needed, just the certainty of what they'd chosen. The road ahead wasn't easy. The galaxy was full of dangers, hunters, wars, the Valtra's lingering reach, and their bond, though strong, would face tests they couldn't predict. But they were ready, not as pawns of fate, but as partners forging their own path. Kalen's hand rested on her back, his fingers tracing the edge of her fur, and Yara leaned into him, her warmth seeping through his shirt. The ship's engines purred, propelling them deeper into the unknown, and the stars outside rolled past, a canvas of possibilities stretching before them. Their journey wasn't ending here. It was evolving, a blend of battles and quiet moments, of passion and mystery they'd unravel together. Yara tilted her head, her silver hair brushing his jaw, and pointed to a cluster of lights on the horizon. A trading hub, maybe, or a new threat lurking in the dark. "What's next?" she asked, her voice soft but curious, her eyes glinting with the same fire that had drawn him in from the start. Kalen shrugged, his hand tightening on her for a moment, feeling the strength beneath her fur. "We'll figure it out," he said, his tone light but steady, his gaze shifting to the controls. He adjusted the ship's heading, a slight nudge toward the nebula's edge, and the dashboard beeped softly, plotting their course. Yara's hand stayed on his chest, her claws grazing his shirt as she watched the stars, her breath a quiet rhythm beside him.